Okay. Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us. So I wanted to just give a very brief introduction to our speaker today. And this is fun for me because I've known Dr. Katie Sullivan for a very long time, since before we could call her doctor. So she graduated from our PhD program with a PhD in pharmaceutical outcomes research a couple years ago, right? Almost 2 years ago.
2018.
Oh, 2018. Okay, almost 3 years ago. That makes more sense. And then she did a 2-year fellowship on campus, and then took this new position with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, which also happens to be my old stomping grounds. That's where I had my first quote unquote real job out of college. And she is a prescription drug epidemiologist with a mental health promotion branch, violence and injury prevention. And she is going to talk to us about using Twitter data and natural language processing. So I'm going to let you take it from here, Katie. Thanks so much for being with us.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Heather. Yeah, it's great to be here. I'm really excited to be sharing this. I think we had it scheduled a little earlier this year, and just things, you know, as this past year and a half has gone, it's been a little, bumpy. So here we are. I'm going to share my screen. Let me know if you can see it. How does that look?
Yep,
okay,
I got it.
Perfect. And then I'm going to actually open up my notes here so that I know what I'm talking about. Okay, so yeah, today I am just going to talk to you about how to use Twitter data specifically for natural language processing research. And just FYI, this is work I did during my postdoc, and it is not work that I'm doing currently with CDPHE. So I just wanted to give that little disclaimer before we get started here. And I hope I remember since I'm on to my next big job here. So basically, I'll just give you kind of a quick rundown of Twitter as a data source for natural language processing research. Then I'll talk about what NLP is, just to give you some background in case this isn't really a topic you're familiar with. And then I'll get into a specific example of a project that we published on that used NLP in Twitter. And then, of course, time for questions at the end. So I think most people probably have heard of Twitter. Perhaps you have your own thriving Twitter account. I think that I'm staying strong at about 5 followers. So you don't have to have a strong Twitter presence to actually use it as a data source, but you can. I just don't. Twitter has about 330 million active users per month. So it's fairly big if you're considering it as a data source for your research. It's primarily useful for evaluating current public discourse and sentiments, but has been used as a data source for a lot of different kinds of research studies. Twitter defines itself as what's happening and what people are talking about right now. So if you're interested in something like current and ongoing sentiments surrounding COVID-19 vaccines, for example, Twitter might be a good source for that. So before you can start using Twitter, you have to get yourself set up. So the first thing to note is that Twitter has an application programming interface, an API specifically catered toward academic researchers, which is actually really neat. Other social media sites don't necessarily have this, which is why Twitter is such a go-to for academic researchers. So if you have a project that you know you want to do, you would go to their developer site and create a Twitter developer account by applying for the academic research product track. And that will give you access to more data than a standard developer account. So for example, you should be able to access historical tweets as opposed to just the past 7 days that a standard developer can access. And through your developer account, you'll be given a specific access token and a specific access token secret that will be used to authenticate the app or the project that you've created in order to use the Twitter API. And once you've done this, you can use whatever program you're comfortable with, like Python or R, to access and query the Twitter data that you want to use for your project. You'll need that access token and that access token secret that they give you when you set up your account to do that. And at this point, I would actually recommend looking up a coding language specific tutorial online that gives you the code you'll need to access the data that you want to query. There are a lot of methods for querying Twitter data, and there are tutorials and GitHub pages that are literally just dedicated to doing this. And those will guide you through much better than I can do in this short presentation today. So, but I will say Toward Data Science is actually a great site that publishes a lot of these tutorials. So I'd probably start there. And, you know, all that being said, this sounds a little bit more complicated than it is. They guide you through the whole process on their website. And it's pretty easy to set this up, and it's a whole lot of fun. So of course, it's important to know who uses Twitter and to reflect on how that may bias any conclusions that we make in a study that uses Twitter data. So Twitter users tend to be younger. They tend to be more affluent. And they tend to be what we might call politically left-leaning. In addition, research shows that about 80% of tweets actually come from the top 10% of users. So depending upon how your queries are structured, you may not be getting a variety of tweets from a lot of different users, but are instead getting the tweets of a small subset of users. So you have to structure your query carefully to make sure that maybe doesn't happen. So, you know, obviously there are limitations to take into consideration if you're considering using Twitter as a data source. So what data fields can you actually access on Twitter using the API? There are really 5 major fields or objects that you can access. And I would recommend going onto the Twitter Developer Data Dictionary that's available online for a better rundown on all of them. But we'll go through them here just briefly. So first you have the tweet, of course, and this is the text of the tweet itself. The tweet object also has the ID, which is actually not the user ID, but rather the unique identifier of that tweet. So every tweet has one of these. And it is how you can programmatically request the API to find that specific tweet. Among other things, the tweet also has the author ID, which is the unique identifier of the user who posted the tweet. And this number can be used to hydrate user objects, which I'll talk about next. So the user field or the object, it's field or object, depending on what field you're in. In computer science, they're called user objects usually, but as a data scientist, I tend to call them fields. But nonetheless, the user field or object contains the metadata for the user. So things like the author ID number, the name, the username, and the name and username are different. When their account was created, you know, they set up all of this. It also has the text of the user bio, if they provide that on their account. Me and my 5 followers, you know, we know each other pretty well, and I do not have a bio. So, you know, you wouldn't find that on my page if you were querying my page. And it also has a free-form location value if they have that. There's also a media data object, which is basically an image, a GIF, or a video attached to a tweet if the user has posted one. The poll object gives you the date and time that a poll was created on Twitter, as well as the options available in the poll. And last is the place field, which, if the user allows on their tweet, is the actual geotag of the tweet, including the name of the place, the type of place, like city. It gives you the country and the location, and this is all in GeoJSON format, which will tell you the longitude and the latitude of where they are. But bear in mind, only about 1 to 2% of tweets are actually geotagged. There may be other ways to get at location data, like in the text of the tweet, for example. But yeah, just 1 to 2% is usually geotagged. So now you know a little bit more about Twitter as a data source, and I'm going to talk briefly about what natural language processing is and how we use NLP, natural language processing, and Twitter in a recent project that we did back in January of this year, just so you know a little bit more about what I'm talking about when I go over that. So these are some of the common ways that natural language processing is used in everyday life. You know, your Alexa, Siri, your Google Assistant, even spam detection. chat bots, and yes, social media monitoring. All these things are actually considered NLP, natural language processing, and we use it a lot more often than you might think. So, those are some examples, but it really has a fairly simple definition. And natural language processing is just computing over human language, basically. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the work that we did that used Twitter data to characterize anonymous physician perspectives about COVID-19. And just a note, like I said before, this was done on data from earlier in the pandemic last year. It was also done during my postdoc. So things certainly might look different now. I imagine they probably would. It'd be really interesting to kind of do this again and see some of the new findings. But anyway, understanding physicians' perspectives about the COVID-19 response helps us to identify opportunities for immediate improved response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and it may even help inform an improved response to possible future pandemics. Though I hate to think about that after this one. But you never know. Physicians have unique frontline experience that lends insight into the impact that COVID-19 has had on frontline healthcare workers, patients, and even the public as a whole. So in our work here, we wanted to gain some insight into these physician perspectives surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic by using Twitter, which has become a valuable resource for evaluating current public discourse and sentiments, particularly during COVID-19. So some physicians at the time, and perhaps slightly less now, maybe not, were actually pretty hesitant to publicly discuss topics like lack of sufficient PPE, testing equipment, or other issues surrounding their COVID-19 experiences for fear of being reprimanded or even let go by their employers. So this makes collecting honest representations of physician perspectives on social media kind of difficult. And in light of those concerns, a specific user account was somewhat uniquely set up where administrators of the Twitter page collected direct messages from physicians and posted them to this page on behalf of those physicians, giving them some anonymity and a platform to express their COVID-19 perspectives. So we extracted tweets from this page that were posted between March 16th and July 17th of 2020. All of these tweets were in English, and to prepare the tweets for analysis, this is something we normally do in NLP. Punctuation, special characters, URLs, and stop words were removed and words were lemmatized. And we ended up with about 875 tweets altogether. So we also wanted to see how these physician tweets, those 875 tweets, compared to the general COVID-19 chatter that was going on Twitter overall. So we used a publicly available large-scale Twitter data set composed of about 513 million tweets containing COVID-19 related discourse. And that data is actually maintained by researchers at Georgia State. And that includes Juan Bonda, who is actually one of the collaborators on this particular project. He's wonderful to work with, very helpful. So then we counted frequencies of the most common bigrams and trigrams in the physician tweets, and you'll see what those are if you don't know what bigrams and trigrams are in a couple slides. So we collected those in the physician tweets, and then we compared them to the most frequent bigrams and trigrams in the larger COVID-19 chatter Twitter data. And with the help of an experienced hospitalist physician, we also identified 4 specific topics that were recognized to be important within physician and public discourse. And those phrases were personal protective equipment, unemployment, telemedicine, and racial injustice. We measured the frequency of these topics and the sentiments of tweets containing phrases related to these topics. So in addition to just counting frequencies of topics in the tweets, like I said, we wanted to evaluate sentiments expressed in the physician tweets and also garner some insight into whether certain sentiment analysis tools, pre-built tools, could accurately assess sentiments of these unique tweets. We chose to use two pre-built sentiment analysis tools. One was called Nrc and the other was called Vader. Both are unique and have their own strengths and weaknesses. But for time's sake, I'm not going to really explain these in detail. We can talk about it in the question section if you're interested. But Vader is actually catered more towards social media data. So we used results from that method to compare it to the larger COVID-19 discourse data and to calculate accuracy measures against manually classified tweets. And by manually, I mean people classified these tweets, read them, classified them, and then we compared those against these tools to see how well they did. So on the left are the most frequent bigrams and trigrams for the physician tweets, and on the right are the larger COVID-19 chatter Twitter data. And I apologize, this is the right one. I usually try to cut off that top COVID-19 so you can zoom in a little better. Apparently I didn't do that, so we'll have to put our binoculars on to see that. You can see phrases from the physician tweets like healthcare, COVID patients need PPE, surgical masks. Those are more specific to healthcare, and being on the front line of the pandemic, those are more specific to that side of it. The more general discourse in green on the right, they are more general, but they also contain more political phrases such as White House, Trump administration, and Dr. Fauci. And by more general, I mean, it's COVID-19 pandemic, coronavirus case, it's COVID-19, and that sort of thing. So let's look at some more information here. So when we looked for the 4 specific topics of interest, so PPE, unemployment, telemedicine, and racial injustice, there were a higher percent of tweets that mentioned PPE with the least mention surrounding racial injustice within the physician tweets. Although all of the percentages are, and though all the percentages are quite small, that does kind of flip in the larger, more general COVID-19 data, and these are really small. But the highest percentage was seen for racial injustice and the lowest percentage was PPE. So for the NRC sentiment analysis method, we can see that overall it found more positive words than negative. And trust was actually, believe it or not, the most frequent emotion identified in the physician tweets, with anticipation and fear coming in second and third. Upon manually reading the physician tweets, trust was not necessarily the emotion that best describes these tweets. So there does seem to be room for improvement here for these sentiment analysis tools with regard to this very unique type of healthcare, written social media data. Now, moving on to the Vader sentiment analysis, the one that is built for social media. These figures show negative and positive and neutral sentiments over time for the physician tweets over on the left. And for the larger COVID-19 data set on the right. In the larger COVID-19 data set, there were slightly more positive tweets over time compared to negative tweets. And there's obviously less distinction among the physician tweets. And of course, there are far fewer physician tweets available. So it is possible that with more tweets over a longer period of time, the sentiments of the anonymous physician tweets would result in a comparable pattern over time to that of the larger COVID-19 data set. So a majority of tweets for both data sets were assessed as being positive with no statistically significant difference in overall sentiment, actually. So here's actually interesting. We assess the sentiments of tweets containing the 4 topical phrases of interest. The small size of the physician tweet data set actually prevented us from assessing these topic-specific sentiments over time, but the overall proportions are listed over here on the right of the slide. The proportion of tweets for both data sets actually trended positive with regard to PPE and telemedicine, while unemployment and racism, as might be expected, trended more negatively. It is interesting to know what is happening in terms of current events during these timeframes. So for example, in the top right graph for unemployment, there is a spike in negative sentiments when unemployment rates reach their highest to that point in time since the beginning of the pandemic, starting in April through May, and then they declined in June. So that's this top graph over here on the right. So, through our work here, we've found that the discourse of anonymous physician tweets does seem to differ from the larger, more general Twitter discourse when it comes to COVID-19 topics. Also, the ability of physicians to maintain some level of anonymity on Twitter holds some importance. Previous studies have actually found that anonymous social media data is different from more general social media discourse, particularly during a social crisis. It tends to result in more honest opinions due to less risk of repercussions. It would be beneficial for future work to improve sentiment analysis tools so they are capable of assessing anonymous physician social media data, since this type of data and these types of masked Twitter handles aren't likely to disappear in the future. They're actually getting more common. And along those lines, since human language is complex, sentiment analysis can be difficult to get right by these tools. We did a manual analysis of physician tweets and scored them positive, negative, or neutral, just as the Vader sentiment analysis tool would do. And upon comparison with Vader, the F1 score was 0.52 with a precision at 0.63 and a recall at only 0.56. And so you can see from the examples in the table here on this slide that there is definitely room for improvement. So just for example, please help, no PPE, please help. The sentiment analysis tool thinks this is a positive tweet, and that's likely because the word help is usually thought to be positive. However, this is very clearly a negative sentiment tweet. Of course, there's room for improvement in our methods. These are just a few. I'd say a biggie was, of course, that the physician tweet sample is very small. So in future, I think it would be really interesting to see results from lexicons that are tailored more toward this specific type of data. Also, I think it'd be of benefit to mine the public Twitter discourse for general healthcare professional data so that, that could then be compared to the anonymous physician data. But overall, Twitter is a rich, if not somewhat messy, data source for natural language processing research, but totally worth it to learn how to work with this data. It's a whole lot of fun. It's really interesting. So with that, I am happy to take any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Katie. That was really interesting. I do not have a Twitter account, but now I kind of want to go get one. So I think that's very cool. Does anybody have questions for Katie? Because if not, I have one that I think I might be able to answer, but I'll ask just in case. I know you mentioned that it's what it was like 70 to 80% of tweets come from the top 10% users or something like that. So the question I wrote down was, is it possible to identify those users or kind of unduplicate or group by those users so you can try to figure out if it's really like how many people are saying something, how many unique people are saying something. But then you did say, you get all the information, unique user ID, all that. So it sounds like you could do that, right? Then.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah. And it's just something you want to be aware of and be careful of, because a lot of times when this was a very unique project that we did because we were literally looking at a very specific Twitter account. A lot of other studies don't do that. So they're looking for keywords. They're looking for, if you're looking at a particular, say, cardiovascular disease, and if somebody's talking about cardiovascular disease and maybe a medication that they took for it or that they were just prescribed, and you'd be surprised what people post on Twitter. They post a lot of this information on there, and you just want to make sure that, you're, not getting the same person over and over and over again. And especially when you're analyzing the data, it can be difficult to do that. There programmatically, there are definitely ways to randomize that. And you might want to get all of them and then after the fact, weed through them. It's a little different. Computer science isn't quite as much of like making sure your data's, randomized. First, you want to get the data. You want to make sure you have the data. And you can glean a lot of things from one person's tweets, maybe, it
Sure.
just depends on what your purpose is, what your objective is. So yeah, but absolutely.
Thank you.
Definitely can.
Thanks. It looked like Laura was going to ask a question. I saw you unmute just as I was starting to talk.
Is there, this is a great talk. This is interesting. We always try to read too much into some of the bumps that we see across the days, but is there standard ways of with Twitter being so immediate of linking like major events to those peaks, you mentioned the job market going south, and that's where you saw it. But there was also a big shift in the physicians at one point. I think a few slides earlier, around June 2020. Yeah, that one. That was such a dramatic difference.
Yeah.
I wonder, you know.
And absolutely. And actually, you know, this is, again, we're dealing with 875 tweets. So I do hesitate to compare these two graphs side by side because we are looking at such different numbers. But the left side, yeah, is the physician tweets. And actually, I did go into their account and see what was happening during this day, this week. And it was a mask drive. So people were donating masks to the hospitals during this week. And it was a huge thing on their Facebook, Twitter account, that, you know, they were all talking about how this was really helpful and really nice and positive. And so that's actually what happened there. So it is good to see that our data, you know, is picking up on these things and that your tools are kind of working. It's really interesting. So, yeah.
I was going to comment that the American Association of Colleges of Pharmacy had a session on natural language processing, and they talked about some of the tools that are used. But some of the examples they looked at were student student applications and things like that were, somewhat relevant to academic pharmacy. But so there's a lot you can do with it with the tools that are available.
Absolutely.
Good talk, by the way.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's a lot of fun. And if anybody needs resources or help, please feel free to reach out. I'll go back to my email addresses here. I'm always happy to answer questions and help with anything that you are interested in doing. I think this stuff is really cool and a lot of fun. So, and even though in future I might be working on some things like this with CDPHE, right now I am not. So I would be happy to help with this side of my passion and keep it going on that side. So
well, thank you, Katie. And we did have a comment from Megan Thompson, who's our a dean of experiential in our school, saying that basically now that she knows she could use it for academic research, she might start paying more attention. So there's so many different. Yeah, go ahead and chime in.
I just had no idea, and I am very curious to know about how to tease out the population that you want. That seems like it's a very nuanced, complicated process, but I am very interested in collecting student data, but I wouldn't know how to even go about doing that. But this is really cool. I had no idea. So thank you.
Of course. Yeah. And, it is a nuanced, it can be complicated. There is literature on it. Academic researchers across the globe are using Twitter to do similar things, and I know it's of interest to look at student data, especially because they're very active on Twitter and it's where they're saying everything, and so it would be really interesting to kind of see how you could get to the bottom of that. And I'm sure there are many ways, many algorithms to try to get there.
I just thank you for that. This is so interesting. I really just had no idea. So thank you. This is really cool. Great work.
I wanted to drop in the chat too. I need to exit my presentation real quick, but I do have a link for you. So let me just copy it here. This is the link to the Twitter for academic researchers, and that's how, those are the steps that you can take to set up your application once you have your idea. And they're very, Twitter doesn't have very, they have criteria. They don't just let anybody through, and you do have to have an idea for your quote unquote app, which is really just your project. But that's where you get started, and it's pretty simple. It's pretty easy to get through there. So they make it pretty clear cut.
Thank you, Katie. This presentation was packed full of so much interesting and important information, even just this website alone. So I I clicked on the website and have it open. Would you be willing to share your slides?
Oh yeah, absolutely,
great. So,
absolutely.
what we'll do, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, no, go ahead, please.
So what we'll do, I'm working with our website developer, Heather Carroll, to try and figure out how to post links to these presentations on our CU Tide website. Thanks, Megan. And so what I can do is I'll at least have the slides and the link to the presentation available. Some people did request it. And I can make sure that I save this link and also have this available for people, because just knowing how to quickly get to this. Now I want to like take the rest of the afternoon and just go try to think of an idea of how to use Twitter data, because this is really
a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. Yeah. Yeah.
Great. Any other questions from people still on the line? Great. Okay. Thank you again. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Katie.
Thank you.
On enlightening us on what we can do with social media data. And I'm going to go sign up for a Twitter account, I think. I'll be your 6th follower, Katie.
Yay, thank you. Yeah, I was going to say, please follow.
Great. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.